You ever sit through one of those family events where the air feels thick with unspoken histories, the kind that cling to you like humidity in a Midwest summer, making every smile and handshake feel like a negotiation you didn't sign up for? And that's exactly how it was at my brother Jake's college graduation last spring in that over-decorated banquet hall just outside Chicago, with its peeling wallpaper and chandeliers that flickered like they were in on the joke nobody else got yet. I remember adjusting my simple navy dress, the one I picked up on clearance, because practicality always trumps extravagance when you're the one quietly holding the family's financial seams together without anyone noticing, and there I was, clapping politely as Jake strode across the stage in his black cap and gown, diploma in hand, surrounded by professors and deans who beamed at him like he was the only student who'd ever amounted to anything, while I sat in the sea of folding chairs feeling that familiar twinge of invisibility that had followed me since we were kids growing up in that modest ranch house in Ohio, where dreams were rationed out unevenly between siblings. My dad rose for his toast then, clinking his water glass with a fork in that theatrical way he had, drawing the room of nearly 200 guests, relatives from both sides, Jake's friends with their fresh-faced optimism, and a smattering of spouses like my husband Tom who knew better than to buy into the hype, into expectant hush, and he launched into a speech with all the warmth of a man who's spent decades in factory shifts telling stories to pass the time, recounting Jake's so-called struggles and triumphs, how he'd juggled part-time jobs and late-night study sessions to earn this engineering degree from the state university, painting him as the resilient underdog who'd risen above it all. And then came the punchline that sliced through the applause like a dull knife through overcooked roast, his voice booming with feigned affection as he raised his glass higher and declared to the only child who ever made me proud, prompting a wave of laughter from the crowd that started as awkward chuckles, but swelled into something more mocking, more communal, as if they were all relieved to join in on the exclusion I alone seemed to embody in that moment. The heat rushed to my cheeks not from shame exactly but from that deep-seated recognition of patterns I'd ignored for years, the way Dad's pride always skewed toward Jake's charisma and easy wins while my steady contributions, the extra shifts at my marketing job to cover household bills, the skipped vacations to fund Mom's unexpected health scares, got filed away as mere obligations rather than the backbone they truly were, and across the table Tom caught my eye with a subtle nod, his hand finding mine under the crisp white tablecloth in a grip that conveyed solidarity without words, the sort of quiet alliance built from 8 years of marriage where he learned early on not to push, but to wait for the right moment to amplify what I couldn't say aloud. As the laughter faded into murmurs and dessert plates were passed around with slices of chocolate cake that tasted like cardboard on my tongue, I scanned the faces around us, catching Mom's fleeting glance that darted away too quickly, laced with what might have been guilt or just discomfort at the room's energy, and Jake himself from his spot at the head table, offering a wink that felt less like brotherly affection and more like a victor's casual dismissal, the kind that reinforced how he'd always skated by on charm while I patched the holes he left behind. We lingered through the obligatory photos and congratulations, relatives pulling me aside with their well-meaning but infuriating platitudes like "You're the rock of the family, Emily, always so dependable," as if that erased the sting of being the punchline in Dad's big moment, and by the time Tom and I made our way to the parking lot under a sky-threatening rain, the weight of it all pressed down heavier than the humid air, making me question for the first time at those sacrifices I'd made. Without fanfare, from co-signing Jake's loans during his undergrad years to wiring money for Dad's car repairs after that layoff scare, had been investments in love or just unwitting subsidies for a narrative that never included me as the hero. Tom drove us home in silence at first, the city lights blurring past the windows like half-remembered dreams, but then his phone chimed with a bank notification that lit up the dashboard, pulling a frown across his usually composed features, and as he glanced at it briefly before focusing back on the road, I felt a spark of something dangerous ignite in my chest, wondering if this was the crack in the facade that would finally force the truth into the open or just another layer of the family's carefully curated illusions waiting to ensnare me further. The drive stretched on through neighborhoods lined with tidy lawns and glowing porch lights, the kind of suburban normalcy that masked so many undercurrents of resentment and unmet expectations, and I replayed the evening in my mind, piecing together subtle cues I'd overlooked before, like the way Mom had hesitated when thanking Jake publicly but skipped me entirely, or how Dad's toast avoided any mention of the practical paths I'd carved for myself after opting for community college over 4-year dreams because someone had to keep the lights on at home, and with each recollection, the uncertainty grew, a nagging doubt about whether confronting this head-on would mend the fractures or shatter the already fragile bonds we'd pretended were unbreakable. By the time we pulled into our driveway, the first raindrops splattering the windshield like hesitant confessions, Tom's expression had hardened into resolve, and he turned to me with words that hung in the air between us, suggesting we look closer at those old statements, because something didn't add up, leaving me on the edge of a revelation that promised both vindication and the terrifying unraveling of everything I thought I knew about the people who'd shaped my life from the start. Easing the car into our driveway that rainy night after the graduation, with water sluicing down the windows like reluctant tears for the illusions we'd both clung to for far too long, I finally allowed myself to exhale the tension that had knotted in my chest since Dad's toast turned the celebration into a personal ambush, and Tom killed the engine, but lingered there in the dim glow of the street lamp filtering through the droplets, his fingers still wrapped around the steering wheel as if holding on to the remnants of his patience while that bank alert blinked insistently on his phone screen, pulling us both into a conversation we'd skirted around for years, but could no longer avoid. He handed me the device without a word at first, the notification detailing an old transfer I'd made to the family account 5 years back for Jake's tuition shortfall. The kind of quiet bailout I'd executed from my laptop late at night after a long day at the agency, convincing myself it was just temporary support for a brother chasing his potential while I settled into the reliability of a 9-to-5 that paid the real bills, and as I scrolled through the history, a bitter laugh escaped me because who knew that generosity would one day feel like the chain weighing down my own progress in this life we'd built together in our modest 2-story home on the outskirts of the city. Reflecting on it all as we stepped inside, shaking off the rain and hanging our coats in the mudroom where photos of happier family moments lined the walls like carefully curated lies, I couldn't help but rewind to those earlier days when the imbalances first took root in our Ohio upbringing, starting with high school when I took on babysitting gigs and summer warehouse shifts to chip in for Mom's medications after her chronic back issues flared up, money that vanished into the household without fanfare while Jake got new sneakers for basketball tryouts and guitar lessons that led nowhere, but still earned him Dad's approving nods at dinner tables laden with pot roast and unspoken expectations. By the time I graduated and enrolled in community college for that practical business associate's degree, forgoing the 4-year university Jake later attended because someone had to prioritize stability over ambition, the pattern was set. I became the safety net, wiring funds from my first real paycheck at the local ad firm to cover his textbook costs when his part-time barista job fizzled out after a month, all while he regaled us with tales of campus adventures that sounded more like excuses than efforts, and Mom would coo over his phone calls home, sharing just enough to keep the pride alive without questioning the sources that propped it up. A couple of weeks after that stinging toast, with the wound still fresh and festering like an untreated scrape from a family hike gone wrong, we decided to host a backyard barbecue to test the waters of normalcy. Firing up Tom's prized charcoal grill under the late afternoon sun that filtered through the oak trees shading our patch of grass, inviting Mom, Dad, and Jake over for what was billed as a casual catch-up but carried the undercurrent of unresolved barbs waiting to surface amid the sizzle of burgers and the clink of beer bottles. Dad arrived with his usual bluster, slapping Jake on the back and launching into anecdotes about his new sales position at the auto parts distributor, how it was the payoff for all those late nights studying circuits and code. And as the conversation looped back to the graduation with Dad reiterating his pride in that golden child tone, I felt the heat rise again, prompting me to lift my own bottle in a mock salute and remark with a smile that cut just enough to draw blood to Jake, the only one who managed to graduate without the family ledger showing every step of the way, the words landing with a precision that silenced the chatter for a beat before Dad chuckled it off as sibling ribbing, though his eyes narrowed in a way that betrayed the discomfort of truths edging too close to the light. Tom had spent those intervening days methodically combing through our financial records in the quiet of his home office, the one lined with shelves of mystery novels and tax manuals that spoke to his methodical nature as an accountant. Cross-referencing my contributions against the vague loans the family mentioned in passing during holidays, uncovering discrepancies like the roof repair on the Ohio house that I'd fully funded 2 summers ago after a storm, money Dad claimed came from his overtime but traced straight back to my savings account depleted just enough to notice. We pored over the printouts together that evening after the guests departed, the scent of grilled meat lingering in the air as we sat at the kitchen island under the pendant light that cast long shadows across the highlighted figures. And Tom's voice remained even as he pointed out patterns I'd overlooked in my haste to help, like how Jake's internship stipends never seemed to cover his share of rent during those lean college months, leaving me to bridge the gaps without a single follow-up question from anyone about the strain it put on my own budget for things like our wedding down payment or the down payment on this house we called home. The satisfaction of that small verbal jab at the barbecue lingered like a secret victory, a witty reclamation of voice in a dynamic where I'd long played the silent supporter, but it also stirred a deeper unease about the light vulgarity of it all. The sheer nonsense of pouring heart and wallet into kin who viewed it as entitlement rather than effort, and as Tom and I discussed next steps over cooling coffee, debating whether to confront them outright or gather more ammunition, my phone vibrated on the counter with an incoming call from Jake's number displayed boldly, the time ticking past 10 o'clock when most sensible conversations had wrapped up for the night. Answering it, I heard his voice thick with what sounded like exhaustion or perhaps the haze of a few drinks at some networking event, rambling about a promising lead on a bigger job opportunity that required upfront capital he didn't have. His words slurring just enough to hint at desperation beneath the charm, and before I could press for details or remind him of unpaid balances, the line went dead with an abrupt click, leaving me staring at the screen in the dim kitchen light, heart pounding with the uncertainty of whether this was his clumsy attempt at reconciliation or merely another hook to reel me back into the cycle of enabling that had defined our sibling bond for so long. Staring at the blank phone screen in the quiet kitchen after Jake's call cut off so abruptly that night, with the rain now a steady drum against the windows framing our suburban view of neatly trimmed hedges and glowing neighbor lights, I felt a surge of frustration mixed with that reluctant pull of old loyalties, wondering if his vague plea for help on that so-called opportunity was just another layer of the family's habitual maneuvering or a genuine crack in his polished armor that might finally force some accountability into the open. Tom set down his coffee mug with a soft clink on the granite countertop, his eyes meeting mine in a shared understanding forged from years of navigating these emotional minefields together. And he suggested almost immediately that we turn the tables by inviting the family for a proper sit-down dinner sooner rather than later, framing it as a chance to celebrate Jake's fresh start while subtly steering the conversation toward the shadows we'd uncovered in those financial trails, an idea that appealed to my growing resolve even as it stirred a knot of anxiety about how such a confrontation might ripple through the fragile web of relationships I'd invested so much in maintaining over the decades. We set the date for the following weekend, transforming our dining room into a neutral ground with its polished oak table that Tom had sanded and stained himself during one of those weekend projects that doubled as therapy. Laying out a spread of homemade lasagna layered with ricotta and spinach from the farmer's market, garlic bread warming in the oven, and a bottle of Cabernet that promised to loosen tongues without tipping into chaos, and when Mom, Dad, and Jake arrived right on time with a bottle of cheap wine as their contribution, the air hummed with forced cheerfulness, Dad launching into updates on his latest fishing trip while Mom fussed over the place settings, avoiding any direct eye contact that might hint at the undercurrents from the graduation still swirling unspoken between us all. Conversation flowed easily at first around the steaming plates, Jake dominating with stories of job interviews and networking mixers where his engineering degree opened doors I could only imagine from my steady but unflashy role managing client campaigns at the agency, and Dad nodded along with that familiar pride swelling in his chest, until midway through the meal when the talk circled back to family legacies and achievements, prompting him to revisit the toast with a chuckle that grated like sandpaper on my nerves, remarking offhand how Jake had always been the one to light up the room while I provided the steady foundation, words that landed with the weight of repeated dismissals disguised as compliments. Tom waited for the perfect pause, the kind that follows a sip of wine and a lull in the laughter, before reaching into the leather briefcase he'd placed discreetly by his chair, the same one he used for board meetings, but now repurposed for this personal reckoning, and withdrawing a slim folder of neatly organized bank statements, sliding them across the table's surface with a deliberate slowness that drew every eye like a magnet, the papers whispering against the wood as he spoke in that measured tone honed from years of auditing discrepancies that hid bigger truths. "That's odd," he said without raising his voice above the clatter of silverware, considering every big bill was paid with her money, the statement hanging in the air like a sudden frost over the dinner's warmth. And the room plunged into an immediate silence so profound that I could hear the faint tick of the wall clock in the hallway, Mom's fork frozen halfway to her mouth with a strand of pasta dangling forgotten, Dad's face flushing a deep red as he snatched up the top sheet to scan the highlighted transfers detailing tuition payments and home repairs traced directly to my accounts. Jake shifted in his seat, his usual easy smile faltering into something closer to calculation, eyes darting between the documents and my face as if weighing whether denial or deflection would serve him better in this unexpected spotlight. I let the moment expand, drawing in the vindication that coursed through me like a long-withheld breath finally released, and then I leaned forward with a wry tilt to my head, adding my own layer to the revelation by saying in a voice laced with humor that masked the deeper hurt, "Funny how pride gets handed out like party favors while the actual heavy lifting shows up on statements nobody bothers to read until it's staring them down over dessert." The words struck with a clever precision, witty enough to elicit a choked laugh from Tom while eliciting sputters from Dad about misunderstandings and how my generosity had always been appreciated in their own way, but the evidence laid bare refused to bend, revealing not just the financial threads, but the emotional ones woven through years of my sacrifices, from the emergency fund I'd drained for Jake's study abroad semester that turned into a backpacking detour to the mortgage supplements that kept the family home from foreclosure during Dad's unemployment stretch, turning the dinner into a tableau of dawning realizations and half-formed defenses. Mom reached for her napkin, dabbing at eyes that welled with what might have been remorse or just the discomfort of exposure, while Jake muttered something about tough breaks and intentions. But the real twist emerged as Tom flipped to an addendum page showing co-signed credit lines in Jake's name that had ballooned unchecked, debts Dad had quietly endorsed without looping me in. The kind of complicity that made the air thicken further with the scent of garlic and unspoken betrayals. As the evening wound down amid stilted apologies and promises to sort things out properly, with plates pushed aside and the Cabernet bottle nearly empty, I savored the small triumph of that verbal counterpunch, a satisfying revenge that reclaimed a sliver of the narrative they'd scripted without me, yet it left me grappling with the dilemma of how far to press this advantage. Spare Jake the full weight of exposure for the sake of sibling bonds forged in childhood sandbox promises, or pursue the unraveling until every hidden corner saw light, even if it meant fracturing the family portrait we'd all posed for so dutifully over the years. Hugs at the door felt mechanical, Dad's grip lingering a beat too long with a gruff assurance that we'd talk business soon, Mom's embrace carrying a whisper of sorry that hung unresolved, and Jake's nod held a flicker of something unreadable, perhaps respect or resentment, as they stepped into the cooling night air toward their cars parked curbside under the street lamps casting long shadows. Just as Tom and I began stacking dishes in the sink, the rhythmic clink of porcelain echoing our quiet processing of the night's upheavals, the doorbell chimed sharply through the house. pulling us both upright with a jolt of surprise since the clock had ticked past 9 and uninvited visitors rarely graced our doorstep at this hour, and when I peered through the peephole to see Aunt Linda standing there, Jake's godmother from my mom's side with her coat clutched tight against the chill and an envelope gripped in her gloved hand, her expression pale and urgent under the porch light. She murmured through the crack in the door that this was important family business she'd held onto too long. Something that tied directly into the debts we'd just aired out and promised to change the entire picture of who owed what to whom in ways that left my pulse racing with a mix of dread and anticipation as she thrust the sealed packet toward me. Peering through the peephole at Aunt Linda's tense figure on the porch that unexpected night after the dinner confrontation, with the envelope clutched in her hand like a ticking package from some long-buried family vault, I swung the door open wider to let her in from the crisp autumn chill that carried hints of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke, her face etched with a mix of reluctance and resolve that spoke volumes about the secrets she'd guarded as Jake's godmother since his baptism in that small Ohio church where we'd all gathered as a seemingly tight-knit unit back when illusions held stronger than they did now. Tom hovered in the background, stacking the last of the lasagna pans in the sink with a quiet efficiency that masked his curiosity, and as Linda stepped into the warmth of our living room, shedding her coat onto the arm of the sofa and settling into the armchair with a sigh that seemed to deflate years of pretense, she began unfolding her tale in a voice lowered as if the walls themselves might eavesdrop on the revelations about to spill forth, starting with how she'd been the unwitting archivist of our family's financial missteps, holding onto faded letters and receipts that painted a picture far grimmer than the one I'd pieced together from bank statements alone. She spread the contents of the envelope across the coffee table under the soft glow of the lamp, yellowed papers and photocopied forms detailing not just the tuition shortfalls I'd covered, but a web of fabrications Jake had spun during his college years, claiming scholarships and grants that existed only in his emails to Mom and Dad while routing the real funds through my contributions without a trace of acknowledgement, and the deeper cut came when she revealed Dad's knowledge of it all, how he'd shuffled documents in their home office to obscure the truths under the banner of protecting his son's future from the harsh light of reality. A complicity that twisted the knife of betrayal even sharper as I realized my role as the family's invisible pillar had been no accident, but a deliberate design to prop up Jake's narrative at my expense. Tom leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed in that thoughtful pose he adopted when processing ledgers that didn't balance, his presence a steady anchor as Linda continued with specifics, like the study abroad program in Europe that Jake had turned into an extended party rather than the academic boost he'd sold it as, or the car loan I'd co-signed that he'd defaulted on quietly, leaving me to absorb the hit on my credit score while he drove on unscathed, and with each detail, the facade of our sibling bond cracked further, revealing the light vulgarity of it all, the outright nonsense of one brother's charm eclipsing the tangible sweat of another, support in a dynamic that now felt less like family loyalty and more like a one-sided transaction I'd never agreed to. The days following that late-night disclosure blurred into a whirlwind of fragmented communications that tested the limits of my patience and resolve, with Jake's voicemails piling up on my phone like unanswered summons to the old ways, his pleas laced with apologies that rang hollow against the evidence Linda had left behind, while Mom alternated between tearful calls begging for understanding and defensive texts insisting it had all been for the greater good of keeping the family intact. During lean times, and Dad's responses came in gruff emails that dismissed the uproar as overblown sibling rivalry amplified by outsiders, though the strain in his words betrayed a man cornered by truths he'd long evaded. I wrestled internally with the dilemma that clawed at my conscience, whether to unleash the full force of exposure and risk dissolving the childhood ties forged in backyard games and shared holiday meals, or to temper my pursuit for the sake of preserving some semblance of unity, even if it meant swallowing the bitterness of being the perpetual fixer in a household where favoritism had always worn the mask of encouragement, and viewers tuning in might find themselves at odds with my hardening stance, questioning if the pursuit of justice warranted the potential isolation from blood that had defined so much of my sense of self. The real twist surfaced unannounced one afternoon at my office downtown, where I was knee-deep in a client pitch for a regional ad campaign when Jake appeared in the lobby. His suit rumpled and eyes shadowed by what looked like sleepless nights spent chasing shadows of his former confidence, pulling me aside into the break room with an urgency that bypassed small talk straight to confession. Admitting that portions of the money I'd funneled his way had vanished into a half-baked app development venture he'd pitched to investors but never delivered on. Not the gambling dad suspected, but a close cousin in recklessness that left him buried under startup debts disguised as optimism. "You were always the smart one, Em," he said with that disarming smile cracking at the edges, his hands gesturing animatedly as if charisma alone could rewrite the ledger, but I saw through the veneer this time. Noting the tremor in his voice that hinted at a man teetering on the brink of real consequences, and in that moment, the emotional pull tugged hard. Part of me wanted to extend the olive branch of forgiveness for the brother who'd shared scraped knees and secret forts with me as kids, yet another part recoiled at the pattern of entitlement that had drained me dry, leaving me to wonder if enabling him further would heal or merely prolong the inevitable collapse. My revenge took shape during the family video call we orchestrated a week later, screens connecting our homes from Illinois to Ohio in a virtual roundtable that crackled with anticipation under the guise of hashing out logistics for an upcoming reunion. And as faces flickered into view, Dad in his recliner with a scowl, Mom at the kitchen table twisting a dish towel, Jake from his apartment looking freshly showered but tense, I shared my screen with a curated timeline of those family investments. Not the raw data, but a polished graphic that looped every major outflow back to my name in a narrative arc designed to illuminate without overwhelming. Narrated in a tone dry with humor as I quipped about how pride turns out to be a collaborative art when you're the one signing the checks that make the canvas possible. Dad's image froze mid-sentence, his jaw slackening into disbelief. Jake's feed glitched as he leaned forward with muttered excuses about intentions gone awry, and the chat filled with a flurry of reactions from half-apologies to deflections, but the sharpest satisfaction came from Mom's prolonged silence, her choice to withhold defense speaking louder than any words and forcing me to confront the cost of my witty exposure. Had I crossed into territory too personal, humiliating Dad in a way that severed ties irreparably, or was this the necessary jolt to redistribute the weight we'd all carried unevenly for so long? Humor threaded through the tension like a lifeline, my offhand remark about serving as the family's unofficial banker drawing reluctant chuckles that eased the edges of anger, yet the uncertainty deepened as the call dissolved into promises of offline discussions, leaving me alone in my home office with the glow of the monitor fading and a gnawing doubt about Tom's recent quietude, the way he'd buried himself in work files during evenings when we'd usually decompress over takeout, making me question if the strain of these revelations was eroding even our partnership or if it stemmed from something more personal bubbling beneath the surface we'd maintained so carefully. Emotions ran high in the aftermath, a cocktail of triumph and regret that kept sleep at bay, and the growing conflict loomed larger with each unanswered text. The impending sense of revenge evolving from a spark to a steady burn that promised more confrontations on the horizon, dilemmas piling up like unopened mail about whether to ally with Linda's truths or retreat to safer ground. As the evening light waned into dusk the very next morning after that call, with coffee brewing in the kitchen and birdsong filtering through the open window overlooking our backyard where autumn leaves gathered in drifts, a thick envelope arrived in the mailbox postmarked from a law firm in Cleveland, its weight substantial in my hands as I carried it inside, the return address unfamiliar yet carrying an air of officialdom that set my nerves alight. And tearing it open revealed not Jake's anticipated confession, but a bombshell regarding a shared inheritance from Grandma's estate that Dad had mismanaged in secret, diverting portions meant for all of us into bolstering Jake's path, while my allocation dwindled to offset the very sacrifices I'd made unknowingly. The documents outlining a choice that could either fuel my final reckoning or entangle me deeper in the family's labyrinth of half-truths and deferred reckonings, my mind reeling with the possibilities as Tom's car pulled into the drive. His arrival timed like a cue in this unfolding drama that left everything hanging on the precipice of irreversible change. Clutching that heavy envelope from the Cleveland law firm in my hands as Tom's car crunched over the gravel driveway that crisp morning after the video call's lingering echoes, with the scent of fresh coffee mingling with the earthy aroma of dew-kissed grass wafting through the open kitchen window, I felt the weight of impending truths pressing down like the accumulated burdens of years spent propping up a family narrative that had always favored flash over foundation. And as he stepped inside, shaking off the chill with a quick kiss to my forehead, his eyes immediately zeroed in on the official-looking packet spread open on the counter, prompting him to pour us both mugs before settling in to absorb the details together in a ritual of shared scrutiny that had become our anchor amid these escalating tempests. The documents unfolded a saga of mismanagement rooted in Grandma's life insurance payout from a decade earlier, a modest nest egg intended as equal shares for her grandchildren to launch into adulthood, but Dad had siphoned portions into what the lawyers termed discretionary advancements for Jake's education and ventures, effectively diminishing my allocation to retroactively justify the very financial lifelines I'd extended unknowingly, a shell game that not only validated every hunch from the bank statements, but amplified the betrayal into something systemic, turning casual family dinners into calculated deceptions where my reliability was exploited rather than rewarded. Tom's brow furrowed as he traced the timelines with a finger, his accountant's precision cutting through the legalese to highlight how this hidden trust had intertwined with the debts I'd shouldered, creating a loop of obligation that kept me tethered while Jake soared unburdened. And in that moment of revelation, a complex brew of emotions surged within me, vindication for the instincts I'd doubted during sleepless nights questioning my own resentment, mingled with a profound sorrow for the grandmother whose generosity had been twisted into another tool of favoritism, leaving me to ponder if this was the final thread to pull or the one that might unravel the entire tapestry we'd woven from childhood holidays in her cozy living room filled with the smell of apple pie and stories of simpler times. We spent the afternoon strategizing in hushed tones over sandwiches at the kitchen table, debating the merits of legal pursuit versus a more personal confrontation, with Tom advocating for the latter to preserve some semblance of reconciliation while my resolve hardened toward a reckoning that would expose the patterns without destroying the core bonds. Though deep down I wrestled with the dilemma of whether demanding equity now risked painting me as the villain in a story where I'd long been the unsung hero. A choice that might leave viewers divided on the balance between justice and the sentimental pull of blood ties that had sustained us through layoffs and losses alike. The climax built inexorably toward our annual Thanksgiving gathering back in the Ohio family home that year, the one with its creaky wooden floors and walls adorned with faded photos of us kids in Halloween costumes and Easter bonnets, where the air would thicken with a roasting turkey savory promise and the undercurrents of unresolved grievances bubbling just beneath the surface of forced merriment, and I arrived with Tom in tow, armed not with accusations shouted across the table but with a sleek tablet loaded with a presentation that wove the financial threads into a visual narrative as digestible as the cranberry sauce Mom always made from scratch. Relatives trickled in throughout the afternoon, cousins with their boisterous kids chasing through the backyard, aunts bearing pies and polite inquiries about everyone's latest chapters, creating a buffer of normalcy that lulled the tension until we gathered around the dining room table laden with platters of stuffing, mashed potatoes flecked with chives, and the golden bird carved with Dad's practiced hand. And as the conversation meandered from weather woes to work updates, I waited for the inevitable toast, the one Dad raised with his glass of store-bought wine, echoing sentiments of gratitude and pride that skirted too close to old favorites for comfort. Seizing the pause after his words faded into clinking glasses, I stood with a composed smile that belied the storm within, proposing my own toast to pride properly this time in a voice steady and infused with the wry humor that had become my shield. Then activated the tablet screen to project the timeline onto the blank wall behind the sideboard, illuminating every transfer, every diverted inheritance share, and every co-signed obligation traced back to my efforts in a flowchart that connected the dots from Jake's graduation pomp to the quiet sacrifices that underpinned it all, the room's chatter dying into a stunned hush as faces turned toward the glowing display. Mom's hand flying to her mouth in a gasp that mixed shock with dawning comprehension. Dad's fork clattering against his plate as he leaned forward to squint at the figures detailing how Grandma's legacy had been funneled into bolstering one path at the expense of another's. Jake sat rigid across from me, his plate untouched, the color draining from his features as the narrative highlighted his app fiasco and the unchecked credit lines, while relatives exchanged wide-eyed glances that shifted from sympathy to subtle judgment. The light vulgarity of the exposure hitting like a collective exhale, the sheer absurdity of toasting to one child's shine while the other's labor remained the unseen glue holding the frame together. My revenge crystallized in that suspended moment with a quip delivered lightly over the pie slices being passed around, remarking that the only child who made you proud might need a calculator to appreciate the full arithmetic of family success. The words drawing a ripple of uneasy laughter from the cousins who sensed the undercurrents without knowing the depths, and it forced the apologies to tumble forth in fragments, Dad's gruff admission over coffee the next morning that he hadn't meant to shortchange anyone, his voice roughened by regret as he gripped his mug like a lifeline, Jake's quieter approach in the hallway later that day with a mumbled acknowledgement that I deserved better than being the perpetual backstop. His eyes meeting mine for the first time without evasion, and even Mom's tearful aside in the kitchen while washing dishes, her hands sudsy and trembling as she whispered how the choices had seemed right in the moment but looked so wrong in hindsight. The satisfaction washed over me in waves, witty and measured in its delivery to sting without scarring irreparably, reclaiming the narrative I'd ceded for too long and redistributing the emotional ledger in a way that felt both empowering and poignant. Yet it left lingering dilemmas that clouded the triumph. Tom's recent distance, revealed in a private moment as him quietly setting up a separate investment account for our future to break free from family entanglements, eased one worry but amplified others about whether I'd pushed too far, alienating kin in pursuit of equity when softer paths might have mended more than they broke. As the holiday wrapped with leftovers packed and hugs exchanged under the porch light that cast warm glows on frost-kissed faces, we drove away into the twilight highway stretching toward Illinois. The car's interior filled with the quiet hum of the engine and the weight of unspoken what-ifs that followed like shadows lengthening behind us, prompting reflections on the ambiguities that refused tidy closure. Would Jake harness this wake-up call to forge his own stability, stepping out from under the favoritism's umbrella to contribute rather than consume, or revert to familiar patterns once the spotlight dimmed, testing the resilience of the apologies we'd extracted? Could Mom and Dad rewrite their script of pride to encompass the full spectrum of their children's journeys, acknowledging the steady hands that built as much as the bold leaps that dazzled? Or would old habits resurface in subtle ways that perpetuated the divides we'd only just begun to bridge, leaving the family portrait forever altered yet fragile against future storms? And for me, emerging from the shadows of invisibility into a light of my own making, had the pursuit of this clever retribution fortified my sense of worth or merely traded one form of uncertainty for another, where the echoes of pride now reverberated with questions about forgiveness's true cost and the enduring ties that bind even when stretched to their limits, inviting contemplation on whether true change blooms from confrontation or withers in its wake.